Good evening. My name is John Bryfonski. I'm the Chief of Police here in Bedford, and this is the February Bedford BeBold Building Our Lives Drug-Free Speaker Series event. Thank you all for coming. This is an event that we have billed to talk about gateway drugs. What is a gateway drug? What is the definition of a gateway drug? Are there such things as gateway drugs? Is it actually true that marijuana is a gateway drug? Or does it depend on the definition of what you think a gateway drug is? Is it a gateway drug for everybody, or is it a gateway drug for only some? Is that true, or is it not true? What are the facts? What's the information? We're here to give you that information, and we have a panel of folks here tonight with us to talk about gateway drugs and marijuana, as well as whether or not we know exactly what a gateway drug is and if they in fact exist. So tonight we have with us Marty Boldin, who is the Governor's Policy Advisor for Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery. We have Diane Vaccarello from Bedford Family Therapy, who is a licensed therapist here in Bedford, and Peg Crowder, who is a nurse practitioner.
Yes.
Thanks, panel. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
I know that each of you have some presentations, so I'm going to turn it over to you,
Sure.
and off we go.
All right, so good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me here tonight. It's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues. And I am of Irish descent, which means I always take 10 words to say when one will do, so somebody's got to give me the hook when I start talking too much. But when we talk about marijuana or the use of marijuana, or we talk about gateway drugs, there's a couple distinctions that are really important to think about and to understand. And the first one is that the typical definition of a gateway drug in the mind of most people is that if you use that drug will necessarily lead to the use of another drug and another drug after that until a person develops a problem with what's called substance use disorder. And to make a long story short, what substance use disorder is it's using alcohol or other drugs in a way that's problematic to your life. And so a lot of study has been done on the theory of gateway drugs, particularly with marijuana, about how does marijuana use impact on a person's drug use in general. And the data is pretty compelling and pretty clear that there are many people who smoke marijuana who don't go on to have problems with significant drugs after that. There's also a giant population of people who smoke marijuana who have significant problem with drugs that they use after that. And so what happens is this debate goes back and forth about, is marijuana a gateway drug? Is it not a gateway drug? And so many studies have been done to really ask a better question. And that is, what is the relationship between marijuana use and having a problem with alcohol and other drug use for people who have substance use disorder? And what we find is that most people who have substance use disorder problems have used marijuana at some point. And the two entryway drugs that most people with substance use disorder start with are either alcohol or cannabis. And the older you are, the more likely, if you're over the age of 30, the more likely it is, if you have substance use disorder, that your career started with primarily a drug like alcohol. If you're 30 or younger, if you have substance use disorder, it's more likely that problem started with the use of marijuana or cannabis sativa. And I think that this is important to understand, because what happens a lot of times is that we try to give people information about drugs, and sometimes we make the mistake of trying to scare people about the information we give them about drugs and drug use or alcohol and alcohol use. And the really important piece of information that almost everybody should have is that different people have different chances of developing substance use disorder. Not everybody has the same chance. In other words, there are genetic and environmental factors that lend to higher chances of having alcohol and other drug use disorder. So the way I like to talk about this to sort of make it clear for people is I like to talk about growing grass. and not the illegal kind. I mean growing grass like in your yard. So I used to live in Concord, New Hampshire, and I bought a house, and it was in a new development. And when I bought this house, I was working like 60 hours a week, and my lawn was not well cared for. And unfortunately, people to my right, people to my left, and especially the guy who lived right across the street from me, these people took a lot of time taking care of their lawn. So to the right of my house, beautiful green lawn. To the left of my house, beautiful green lawn. Across the street, you could like golf on the lawn. My house was this terrible brown dying dust bowl. And it was so bad that about 4 months after we moved in, there was one of those Google aerial photos of our neighborhood, right? And one of my neighbors came up to me one day and showed me like, this is the neighbor on this side, this is the neighbor on that side, and then there's my brown death lawn. And why was my brown death lawn a brown death lawn? Well, it was a brown death lawn for 3 reasons. 1, I did not water it. 2, I did not fertilize it. 3, I did not seed it. And on both sides of me and across the street, people watered their lawn, they seeded it, they fertilized it, and had these opulent lawns, and I had the brown death lawn. So then the first thing I decided to do is I decided to try to like water my lawn. And what I found out from that was that just watering your lawn doesn't make it green and opulent, because if what's growing there is weeds, all you get is like more weeds. And the other thing I found out is that grass, that the lawn and the soil has to be in a certain condition for grass to grow. I didn't realize that you had to have a certain amount of soil. And some parts of my soil were very shallow. So I brought in what they called, well, a fancy word for dirt is loam. So I brought that in, and I still had garbage because I didn't realize that you couldn't just buy any fertilizer. You had to buy special fertilizer. And it took me about 3 years to finally get my lawn to like look like a semi-normal lawn. Well, you have lawns on both sides of you. You have your house lawn, and you have the lawn across the street. And so if all the loam, if all the dirt in all the houses is exactly the same, and you throw 1,000 seeds in one lawn and 10,000 seeds in another lawn, which lawn is going to be greener? The lawn that has 10,000 seeds. The more seeds that you put in the loam, the more chance grass is going to grow. If you water one too much, it'll drown. If you water it too little, it'll die. If you water it the right amount, with the right soil, with the right fertilizer, your lawn will grow. Well, you all have your own environment as well. And one of the problems with marijuana and the way that marijuana seeds substance use problems for people is that there are conditions in the environment that are perfect for creating problems with substance use disorder. And one of them is having too much availability to alcohol or other drugs. The biggest indicator of whether or not a young person will develop problems with alcohol or other drugs is not a genetic marker, it's the availability of alcohol or other drugs. And most people get alcohol from their own home. Most young people don't go to like an older person to buy alcohol for them. They don't get it at a party somewhere. Most young people get their first drink from their very own refrigerator, from their very own liquor cabinet. With marijuana, it's slightly more complicated. Most people don't get their first marijuana from their own home. Most of them get it from a friend. But the more marijuana that's available, the more alcohol that's available, the more problems you'll have. So if you have 2 groups of young people and they're almost identical, and one has access to 3 liquor stores and 3 drug dealers, and the other one has access to 5 liquor stores and 5 drug dealers, the group of young people that have access to more people dealing alcohol and dealing drugs are going to have a higher percentage of problems with alcohol or other drugs. It's just that simple. Another environmental factor that affects us is a genetic background. Do you have a history of substance use disorder in your family? Now, the reason I talk about this, and this is extremely important, is that people in general don't talk about this in their families. People that have a background of alcohol misuse or other drug misuse in their families, it's not something that people share or they talk about a lot around tables. And so a lot of times people will come to me and I'll assess or evaluate them for substance use disorder, and they will have all the markers of a person who has a family history of alcohol or other drug abuse in their family, and I'll say, do you have that kind of history? And they'll say to me, I don't know. And so one of the pieces of homework I give people is I say, you know, call somebody in your family you trust and ask them, did any of your aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, did anybody have a problem with alcohol or drugs that we didn't talk about? And almost invariably, people will come back to me and tell me that that history exists there. So if you have an environment that has lots and lots of alcohol or drugs available in it, and if you have a family history, the chances of a person having a substance use disorder problem are pretty significant. Genetic data tells us this, that if you have one parent who has a substance use problem, your chances of developing a problem are about 50%. If you have two parents that have a substance use problem, your chances of developing a problem are about 70%. We know that is generally true, but it also means that there are people that have one parent that never have a problem. There are people that have two parents that never have a problem. What we think the difference is between the people who have problems and the people who don't with the genetic marker is that people who do have a problem have more access to alcohol and other drugs. And the reason I bring that up is that we're having this conversation right now in the midst of what's being called the opioid epidemic. And just to let you know, in order for something to be an epidemic, it's not just a name we throw on something. There's actually a scientific level of intensity that you have to come to in order for something to be an epidemic. And basically, an epidemic happens in a society when the prevalence of a problem matches more than 3% of the population. So I'm here to tell you that in New Hampshire, we have a legitimate opioid epidemic. And we've suffered, hundreds of deaths, 475 last year, 475 this year. The amount of people that are presenting with opioid use disorder in emergency rooms and in law enforcement community are significant. And the reason I bring this up is that part of the problem that we have in the state of New Hampshire right now is that we're in the middle of an opioid epidemic. So marijuana and marijuana use is not completely separated from that environment. Any illicit drug use that's happening right now is a part of the environment that affects the way that we experience opioid use disorder. And so people have said for a long time, well, is marijuana a gateway drug? If I smoke a joint, am I going to be like, using heroin in 6 months or a year? And the answer is yes. The more marijuana a person smokes, the more likely it is for them to develop an opioid use problem. But it doesn't mean that every person who smokes marijuana develops an opioid use problem. The more problems you have smoking marijuana, the more likely it is that you're going to have problems with other drugs, including opioid use disorder. And so a researcher named Olson did a pretty sophisticated statistical analysis where they studied waves of data. And basically what they found was that they looked at 4 different groups of marijuana users: people who didn't use at all, people who used a little bit, people who used moderately, and people who are heavy marijuana users. And then they looked at that same group of people five years later, and what they found out was that heavy and moderate users ended up with opioid use disorder at about 8 times the likelihood of somebody who didn't smoke marijuana at all, and people that were light marijuana users ended up with opioid use disorder at about 3 times the amount of use of people that didn't smoke marijuana at all. So what this says is kind of common sense. If a person smokes marijuana regularly, the likelihood of them developing other substance use disorder related problems is greater than if you compare their use of that drug to somebody that doesn't use marijuana at all. And so what does all that mean when you say it in a pretty sophisticated way? Marijuana is not a gateway drug for all people, but it is a gateway drug for people like me. I'm a person, besides advising the governor and doing a bunch of other stuff in this field, I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means for me that over 30 years ago, I had a substance use disorder problem. People like me, people who have substance use disorder, we have greater chances of developing tolerance to the drugs we use and then increasing the use of the drugs that we use. We start off trying drinking and smoking marijuana in moderate, but the longer that we use, the more intense our use is. So what I say to people is, it's much more important to know whether or not you have the likelihood of developing substance use disorder than to take a risk smoking pot and involving yourself in an endless debate about what are the necessary chances that a person smoking pot is going to necessarily end up with a much more significant problem. It's much more important for you to know whether or not you have the likelihood to develop substance use disorder. And the way to figure that out, number one, is to find out about your family history. And the second thing to look at in that is to see, if you're using alcohol or other drugs, is your use of those things more than, almost no or very, very occasional use. And if you're an underage person, if you're using alcohol or other drugs at all, you're increasing your likelihood of developing substance use disorder, either with the drug you're using or with other drugs significantly, especially if that use starts before the age of 14. People who use alcohol or other drugs before the age of 14 have a significant likelihood of developing substance use disorder in their middle teen, late teen, and early adult years. So I feel like I'm putting people to sleep now, so I'm going to take a little break. And I'll probably say more later, but I think that was an okay start, right? All right, good. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Peg Crowder. I'm a nurse practitioner, but I'm really not here as a nurse practitioner. I work in recovery in addiction. That's a specialty that I'm working in now. Pain management was my beginning. I'm family practice. I'm here because I have a son who has substance use disorder. And quite frankly, he was like many of you. He was raised, nothing unusual in our household. Nobody drank too much. Nobody did any drugs. He was the leader of his group of friends. He was an avid athlete, a very good student. He still is, but somewhere around 13, he started smoking some pot. Actually, before that, he started playing video games that I noticed that was a little bit of an alarm. And I might add here that, yes, we have substance use disorder in the family, like grandparents and some cousins, but nothing that he saw. And the marijuana became, that was it. That was everything. It was every day, I think, within a year and a half. And he was an excellent student. He was an excellent athlete, playing, very active in 3 sports. He was a leader amongst his friends. And never in his life did he ever think that he would ever have a problem, ever. And I have to tell you, he got to 18 after hell 3 years of everything, any intercession that I could possibly do. And then he asked me for help. And, prior to that, he had a gun in his mouth. I'm like, there was no guns even in my house, right? I've never even seen one. I mean, his whole life went just horribly nightmarish. And he used opiates for 22 days and then begged for help. And I'm happy to say, he's 18 months sober. He's done a lot of work and a lot of time. He's going to college now. But that was devastating and nothing that anybody could predict. Nothing that anybody could predict. But I can remember saying to him at one point, when he was probably your age, sitting on the stairs and saying, you know, this is the thing, when it's no longer recreational, when it's no longer every once in a while I'm going to get, you know, to just hang out with my friends and not a big deal, we're just going to do this. When it's not that anymore, when your whole life is being run by it, you got a problem. And he looked at me and he said, I'm going to stop. I'm done. And he couldn't. Came down crying. He was crying the next day and saying, I can't. And it was devastating. And I watched, you know, I as we all do, anybody, I mean, really, what was it, the pumpkin picking or the apple picking? Was it the altar serving? You know, where did we go wrong here? And, you know, he just said to me, I never knew that I had this. I didn't know that I had this, that this would ever occur. I was not going to ever be in that place. And when I found myself there, it was such a hopeless and horrifying thing because I judged people that did that. And here I was. And then he learned, you know, we sent him away, and he did a lot of hard work, and it wasn't easy. And there were trips along the way and falls and standing back up and knowing who he was. And finally now is rebuilding who he is, you know, and understanding that this is just a piece of his pie. You know, it's just something that he has and will not go away. You know, he has to be very careful. But you know, just to tell you all, I think the biggest thing is to know it's within you. And as you know, every teenager, it's within you to make that decision. And I can promise you this: there isn't one person addicted to opiates or with substance use disorder, certainly here in the state of New Hampshire or anywhere else, that ever said, I will be that when I grow up. I will do that when I grow up. That will never happen to me. And then all of a sudden, they're down the slide and they're on this hamster wheel of hell that they have no idea how to get out of. And they judge themselves. The stigma is so intense, and they judge themselves so badly that it's so hard to emerge, right? And even those that are in recovery now, you know, there's still that stigma, and they're just people like we are. They just have a disorder, like diabetes, like kidney disease, like something. But because we don't understand the dynamic totally about what happens in a person's brain that brings them there, you know, it makes it very difficult. So that's why I'm here.
This is Peg.
You're welcome.
Telling your story. I know everyone out here appreciates, I'm sure that your bravery to share that. And I wanted to just mention my name, Diane Vaccarello. What I'm here to talk about is professionally the experiences that I have in working with many individuals and couples and families in our town and in our surrounding town. I want to talk about how a lot of what Marty and Peg have discussed and kind of bring it into our home space, our community. So I might bounce around a little bit, and I'm certainly open to questions. We all are at the end of this. Keeping in mind just one thing, I'm not sure if Chief mentioned that we are streaming live on TV as well, so we just wanted to make sure people were aware of that. So I'm going to try and fit 20 pounds of information in a 5-pound sack. So I'm just going to move through some information that I put together, kind of piecemealing different presentations, but really trying to add some anecdotal or sort of real life patterns that I've noticed in working with people in our area. So I wanted to point out, I'll start the presentation and end it with the idea that prevention is much easier than treating addiction. So that's what BeBold is here to talk about prevention, talk about education from really as early as we can. If we're talking to teenagers when they're 13 and 14, that's too old. We need to be moving that up towards closer to 9 or 10. That's the average age of folks by the time I am working with them as teenagers, or even as they're older and they think back to their stories, similar to what Peg has mentioned, that it's really around the age of 9 or 10 that most adolescents who have an addiction indicate that they started using marijuana or alcohol. So I wanted to share a research that was published this past November. So it's fairly recent, by Columbia University. And if anyone has seen any of my presentations, I use a lot of examples just of rat surveys, rat research. So there was a study in which rats were exposed to, and when I say gateway drug, I'm referring to alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, just in a general sense. But specifically marijuana, tonight is what we're focusing on. But rats exposed to a gateway drug like marijuana were far more likely than other rats to press a lever that released cocaine. So that's how it was set up. There's a lever that would release cocaine. Alcohol also was found to suppress 2 genes that normally acts as cutoff switches for the effects of cocaine, which created a permissive kind of environment within the brain for the drug. So interestingly, there's no enabling effect when the order is reversed. So in other words, when taking cocaine first, it did not make rodents more susceptible to the effects of alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine. So using one drug changes our brain in such a way that using another drug becomes more rewarding. This supports the idea that some drugs, like nicotine, marijuana, alcohol, are better positioned than others to act as place setters. So there is an order, and I think it's also important to emphasize here that there are no hard and fast rules either. That there are 3 sort of theories that I want to present. One is common liability theory, and that's that certain people, by virtue of biology, this is something Marty was mentioning, environment, or both, are simply more likely than others to become addicted to drugs. This explains why some people can get away with using certain gateway drugs and never become addicted. So the gateway theory is more dealing with the initiation of the use of various substances. So the 2 perspectives, in my opinion, are complementary, and a lot of the research supports that it's complementary. It's not an either-or kind of a situation. And then when you add the why, so if we look at the common liability, meaning there's a propensity for biologically, and the gateway theory, when we talk about marijuana, use towards a propensity to continue to use cocaine or to use cocaine. And we add the why, it's important to identify the why are kids starting to use drugs. And as parents here, that's really where a lot of the work that I do comes in, working with families, is really identifying, what else do they have going on? Are there underlying psychological or mental health issues that are not being treated? Is the person using the substance doing it in some form of a self-medication component? There's definitely tendencies or characteristics that encourage or increase the probability that people could do all kinds of different deviant kinds of behaviors. But definitely the order in which doing the drugs will have an impact on whether or not a person is going to do other drugs. Not everybody. What are some of the other risk factors? Just like Peg mentioned, obesity increases the risk of diabetes, for example. Smoking is a risk factor for teen substance use. And other risk factors include early aggressive or disruptive kinds of behaviors, not just sort of toddler-like behaviors. We're talking significant disruptive, aggressive behaviors. Depression, ADHD, anxiety, certain eating disorders. If your child has early risk factors, we need to get them help. 2/3 of substance abusers suffer mental health issues. That's a really significant number. So the co-occurring comorbid nature of this is very significant. So partnershipfordrugfree.org reports children who learn about the dangers of substance use from parents are 50% less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. And as Marty mentioned, at a young age, we need to be, focusing on that, because the chances of continuing with a lifelong addiction increase when that use starts below the age of 14. Teens who know their parents disapprove of drugs are less likely to use, and vice versa, by the way. That's also something I've noticed in working with family systems. So we need to be good role models and create clear rules for kids. If a child understands and respects the limits, they are typically less likely to push them. Being overprotective or overly harsh or punishing, just like being too permissive or absent, in fact, can increase possibilities of teenagers prone to addiction. Being involved in our child's life, getting to know, and I can't emphasize this enough, getting to know their authentic self, their real self, accepting that real self, that's a really critical piece, because there's a lot of self-esteem that can be, low self-esteem, and you match that with a biochemical propensity. It's really a dangerous combination, those two things. And self-esteem issues are very pervasive in addictions with teens. So bring out our child's best self and their authentic self. I really can't emphasize that enough. So this may sound like it goes without saying, or it doesn't need to be said, but as I mentioned, working with a lot of families in our greater surrounding area, it does need to be said that we never should be taking drugs with our child. That may sound like a shocking statement, but I have yet to see a child who did drugs with a parent and in the long run thought it was a positive experience. And I can't tell you how many people, as adults, looking back on their situations, or as teenagers, or even talking with parents, in which case they may not be doing that with them right next to them, but having an awareness that their parents are smoking marijuana, or that the parent is aware that the child is smoking or experimenting. It's a vicious cycle, a belief system kind of cycle that can really spiral, and basically set people up for a lot of false beliefs around that. Speaking of cycle, if I could just describe the marijuana cycle of what, again, this is just what I've seen as a pattern. And this is what oftentimes early adults who are in college will sort of come back and talk about their experience, or in high school years, sometimes younger than that, that regular use of marijuana this is straight from the mouths, that it does lead to dependence. It causes users to have a hard time stopping when it's used repeatedly and frequently. And when used regularly, they crave it and give up important activities to use it. So when starting to notice those patterns where activities are being interrupted, different relationships are being impacted, and their everyday sort of patterning of what they're commonly doing changes, and swapping that out for using. If they stop, they can suffer withdrawals like irritability and anxiety and changes in mood and sleep and appetite. If you can imagine having pulled away from a lot of those activities, and those mood changes and irritability and anxiety are increased because of stopping it even, with withdrawals or irritability, what that tends to do is cycles them back into use again, because those are things that they're having a difficult time tolerating the distress of. They're already having a difficult time tolerating the distress of whatever other normal sort of life stressors are going on. And so the withdrawals are coming out of that cycle, brings them back into the cycle. It obviously affects a lot of different things, like the way they're thinking and feeling and learning, and one sort of problem snowballs into other sorts of problems. And sometimes they get to the point where using marijuana is not enough to sort of numb out from that, or to deal with whatever it was that they thought it was helping with before, especially if there's anxiety involved. And it oftentimes will lead to other substances as well. So the top 3 causes of death in the United States for teens. Does anyone care to guess what those top 3 things are? Marijuana? Okay, any other ideas on what the top 3 causes of death for teenagers are? Okay, so accidents. Yep, so accidents are definitely the top 3. So homicides are the other, and suicides are the other. So for each of those 3 problems, the prevalence of a linkage to substance abuse is astronomically high. So when you think of what is the top 3 things that kill our teenagers, they're linked to substance abuse in one way, shape, or form or another, furthering that or facilitating that. So what impacts a teen's decision to use marijuana? Oftentimes, it's friends, it's parents, it's peer pressure, and it's portrayal of marijuana in the media. That goes for things like vaping as well, you know, in media, or in especially the peer groups, the availability of those things. Waiting, like I mentioned before, to educate until 14 years old is too late, and we need to be doing it as soon as possible. So again, the notion that prevention is easier than treating addiction is where we need to keep our mindset, and really paying attention to the sort of layering effect of what all of these biological, social, emotional, spiritual needs of our kids, the whole picture, we need to really take a look at and see how we can support them and their authentic selves the best, so that they really don't need to try and use in the first place.
Well, panel, great information, scientific, down to earth, and practical. I think those are the 3 great things that the panel presented. And to sort of sum it up a little bit, it seems like we're talking about, for the public, 3 basic things that affect whether or not an individual may be susceptible to a substance abuse disorder. A, the way that the brains are wired, neurological predisposition, right? It's just the way your brain is wired. The second piece is the genealogical marker that Marty talked about quite a bit. And then the third piece is access. If we're swimming in a culture and a society of drugs, access is the other piece that, combining with the others, sometimes create a toxic mix of an environment and culture that makes it very difficult for folks not to become involved in some sort of behavior that may lead to an addiction disorder. You know, folks, last month we had 3 young men from New Hampshire Teen Challenge. I just want to share that and turn it open to questions here before the end of the hour. And one of the things that I came away with was their experience in dealing with their own individual substance abuse disorder history. And in knowing what you folks just presented, and listening to those 3 folks, and listening to you, Peg, about your son, the scary thing about all this is, I think, for the public and for parents and for kids, is that you don't know. No matter how much you may know about your family background, you're certainly not going to know whether or not your brain is wired that way unless you have some sort of major testing, and that's not going to happen. And we all know that we swim in a culture and society that's filled with drugs. And I think listening to Marty and all three of the panelists, folks, you come away with the notion that, well, one kid may try marijuana and never have a history of substance abuse disorders or problems, and yet could be a sister or brother in the same family, and that person ends up with a lifetime of tragedy. So you just don't know. And that's the thing that young people, I think, need to understand, is that you don't want to be a test pilot with this stuff, right? Because that's what it is. You open that door, it's like the old game show. What's behind door number 2? Well, it may be a new car for Marty, but it might be a lifetime of tragedy for me. And you won't know until you open that door, and after you open the door, you have to walk in, and it's too late. So we're going to open this up for questions, and if you raise your hand if you have a question for the panel, I'll bring you the mic. Remember, we are live, so keep it clean, folks. Questions from the audience? I'm sure you have some questions.
So, you know, I hear that marijuana is stronger than it used to be. Is that a factor? And also, are the different forms of marijuana a factor in substance misuse?
Go ahead.
Yeah, the statistics show that marijuana from 1970, for instance, had like 10% THC. Today it's 90. So the marijuana that's out there it's a drug, and I mean, hands down, it is a drug, and it has very different effects from what it had for those kids in the 60s and 70s. It's stronger. It's a lot more intense, and anybody that develops a problem with it, they're doing it all the time, and it's very alarming, actually.
Questions?
How does the legalization of marijuana affect this problem? Does it make it better or worse?
Great question.
Go ahead. I'll take it after you.
Yeah. Quite honestly, I think that the legalization, I don't, and I'll be honest, Marty probably knows more of the statistics, but my gut feeling would be it'd be better to have it legalized and structured, and kind of all the education that went into smoking cigarettes and how our smoking has gone down in the country, drinking alcohol, but then now alcohol is actually becoming more of a problem now. But the restriction is, and the I would think would be better, but I know that you have a lot more facts and information, that's more solid. That's just my opinion, because we're not going to, as a if it's legalized, it's not going to be sold. It's going to be restricted to 21 and under, as it is in Colorado. I don't know how that's going on, or how it's working out there, but I think maybe some time might be a little bit more beneficial, quite frankly.
So there are a lot of reasons why legalization may not be anywhere near the solution that you think it would be. Let me just give you a couple pieces out there that are important to understand. In New Hampshire, we have access to medical marijuana. That's been the case since 2012. So people who have a condition like cancer, some people have fibromyalgia. There are ways to access legal marijuana distributed through medical facilities for people who are using it for medicinal services, for medicinal reasons. Marijuana also last year was decriminalized in the state. And in part, that was done because there was a popular story out there that wasn't mostly true, that indicated that a lot of people were doing serious time in prison for possession of small amounts of marijuana. as I'm not a law enforcement officer and I don't play one on TV, but I've worked with law enforcement my whole life, and I've worked in and around a lot of incarcerate facilities with lots of people who've distributed drugs. And I can promise you this, since 1987, when I started working with incarcerate people, I never met anybody who was doing serious time for like small amounts of drugs. That doesn't mean there aren't like rare instances where that's the case, but it's certainly not a significant issue. So the question that seems to be left is like, should we legalize marijuana? And what I would say to you is that if you read studies or if you look into this, you don't have to pay attention to me, but there are lots of things happening in Colorado and Washington State that people didn't anticipate before those laws were passed. One friendly amendment to what Peg said is that THC levels in marijuana in the 60s through the mid-70s were somewhere around 7, 9, 10%. Now they're somewhere around 27, 28%. And so what that means is the marijuana today is about 3 times stronger than it was, 40 years ago. But here's the thing that I think maybe Peg was referring to that isn't that clear. That places that sell, that have legal marijuana produce all these products, edibles, gummy bears, all these things. These have 90% THC in them. They're pure THC. When people take these drugs, when people take THC at that quantity, there are all kinds of unintended medical consequences. People showing up in emergency rooms at enormous rates. One of the things that's interesting about what Diane said that you're not going to hear marijuana proponents talk about is that, yeah, there hasn't been a massive uptick in the number of young people in Colorado who are using marijuana because Colorado since 2012 has had more marijuana use per capita in adolescents than anywhere. But what they aren't telling you is that school incidents for drug use in schools in Colorado are up not 10% or 20%, but they're up 450% since 2014. And so what this means is that kids in school-age kids are being identified by people in school using marijuana at much, much higher rates than anything that happened before. Last thing I'm going to say I'm going to say 2 other things about this. This is something you need to know about substance use in general. People like me, people with substance use disorder, we represent anywhere from 15 to 30% of the population at any given time. We use 70% of alcohol and other drugs that are out there, be they prescription, illicit drugs, legal drugs. We use 30% of the people use 70% of what's out there, right? So this is what I say to people about legalized marijuana. If you're selling marijuana for a living, and that's the people that are perpetuating the idea that legalized marijuana is the way we should go, are you selling marijuana to the 70% of the people that smoke 30% of the product? Or are you selling it to the 30% of the people that are smoking 70% of the product? You're selling it to me. And the reason you're selling it to me is because you know I'm going to misuse it. You know I'm going to use it to the point of having a problem with it. That's the reason this issue is being moved forward. And people in the alcohol industry know this. They know that their profit margin is based on underage drinkers and problem drinkers. People who sell in the pharmaceutical industry know that their market is people that have problems with substance misuse or have likelihood of developing that. So when people are out there and they're saying, well, if we legalize marijuana, we'll be dealing with social justice, like, don't buy that. That's hooey. What they're doing is they're saying if we can make most people think that marijuana is innocuous, that then we can make a lot of money selling this to people that are going to have substance use disorder after they do it. And I'm not talking a little bit of money. I'm talking about a bunch of money. The people behind this are not like people like in tie-dye T-shirts selling dead tickets. That's what I did 40 years ago. The people doing this are large industrial, it's a complex. It is big marijuana. Those are the people that are interested in this. And the last thing I'm going to say is this, is that everything I just said to you is verifiable. It's not opinion. It's based upon research. There's a lot of study that's been done on this. But regardless of whether or not you buy any of that or not, just ask yourself this common sense question. If we're really in the middle of an opioid epidemic, and if you don't believe we are, come hang out with me. Like, we can get in my car right after here. I can drive you over to a recovery center in Manchester. I can drive you to a couple detoxes. Like, come with me. I will show you the opioid epidemic, no holds bar. Is this really the time in this state that we should be making another addictive drug more available, promoting the idea that it's harmless? You know, one of the things that Diane said before, which is so true, is that one of the most destructive things a parent can do with a child is to sanction illicit or even, you know, alcohol use. Like, drinking with your kid is not a good idea. A lot of parents say, like, well, the party's at my house, then nothing bad's going to happen. When the party's at your house, what you're doing is you're sanctioning your child to engage in a high-risk behavior. And your perception of substance misuse is directly correlated to whether or not your child is going to engage in early use behavior. Directly correlated to that. So what I would say to you is, like, be careful about this. Be very, very careful about it. And what I would say finally is that this simply isn't the time for us to have the conversation about marijuana legalization. Let's wait about 5 more years, see what happens in other states, and see what's happening in this state before we pick it up again. Sorry.
Can I just add a couple of things to that really quickly? So I think that the confusion that would elicit in terms of legalizing, again, we live within a system, a family system. So that family system needs to have clear boundaries and rules and expectations and supports. That family lives within a community system, lives within the state system, and so we all affect one another, and sending that kind of a message goes directly against the opioid epidemic that we are facing, that is real and live and active. As Peg mentioned early on, teens rarely think marijuana use is going to lead them to problems, but I will tell you that the majority of adolescents who enter drug rehab do so for marijuana. And I'm talking to you not about the number of adults that do, the number of teens that enter into drug rehab do so for marijuana. I couldn't emphasize that enough. And so if that is already currently happening with our teens, and we have what used to be big tobacco is now big marijuana, companies who are in business, right, that is profiting off of this type of a possibility, with, you know, already profiting, but could profit even greater. Targeting our young people. You know, vaping is a huge, huge issue in our schools. In Bedford, middle school, high school, I believe that most of us know that. There's vaping marijuana. You know, you can't smell it as much as you typically would with straight up marijuana, the old school days, right? We're talking about serious, serious problems here, and it all points to legalizing marijuana, points to more problems for our kids.
We have time for a few more questions.
Thank you guys for taking the time out. I want to make a quick comment. I look around, I see a lot of young kids, and man, I feel so old saying this, but you guys are growing up at a time in human history when you have more access to information and you have more access to do literally whatever you want to do with your life. And your brains, you guys are growing and learning so much every day that to take any kind of mind-altering substance is just tragic. And as you get older, the temptation is going to be almost impossible to avoid, but you guys have to fight with all your being to avoid that, because this is just such a huge time in human history for you guys, and to throw that away, I see it all the time with the opioid epidemic, that it's really tragic, and it just takes one mistake, as a gentleman made or comment earlier. But my question would be, you know, as bad as the opioid epidemic is in this state, why are we decriminalizing the users and focusing almost too much on treatment and not the fact that they've broken laws? And what I personally see is individuals who have chosen to break the law and unfortunately are now wrapped up in an addiction that's almost unbeatable. And as a result, they're not facing any legal ramifications. And Chief, maybe you can expound on this, but if you commit a crime and you don't pay the punishment for the crime, where are you learning? At what point is it that we have to come back to law enforcement and say, not you individually, but the enforcement of laws, and say, you have broken a law and you must pay the crime for it. You must pay the punishment for it. And we see it even now with the decriminalization of marijuana, where you get caught with an illegal substance. It's illegal in the state of New Hampshire to have marijuana, but all we're going to do is give you a $100 fine and take it from you. How are we supposed to win the fight when, from our legislative standpoint, we've already given up?
Well, I'll tackle the first part of that. And in the time that we have left, a few minutes, Criminal Justice 101, right? So the legislators who represent all of us go to Concord and go to Albany, New York, and they go to all the other capitals across the country, and they enact law. And the law is supposed to send a message to the populace that the greater good does not want you to do whatever this behavior is, whether it's steal or harm someone or do drugs, because there's a harmful element to it. And so we enact a law, right? When it comes to substance abuse and drug abuse, that law is in place to send the message that, yes, this is something that society does not want you to do, and there will be sanctions and repercussions if you do it. We also know that, and the panel can fill in the blanks here, we also know that sending someone to jail and someone that has a substance abuse disorder is not going to come out of jail and all of a sudden decide, well, that was a bad experience, I'm not going to use drugs again. That doesn't happen for most people. And so what we need to do is look at how we can leverage the criminal justice system properly to make sure that people that have a substance abuse disorder that get engaged in the type of crime that we deal with here in Bedford, property crime, burglary, shoplifting, people that are going out stealing your things from your cars and your businesses and your homes to be able to support their drug habit, right? We need to address the underlying problem and use the behavior that got them into trouble to leverage the treatment that they need to get them well. That's where the criminal justice system comes into play, and frankly, folks, that's where we had not done well in New Hampshire and in the rest of the country, right, in using that lever properly to make sure that people that do come to our attention, that we do arrest them for whatever property crime it may be, or God forbid worse, that have a substance abuse disorder, that we say, okay, look, we know that you have this issue. We are going to put you into a treatment recovery program that is generally able to get some good results from folks. And you have a couple minutes, maybe if one of you want to respond to that.
I work in recovery, and I'm telling you right now, there's a lot we don't know, but I can tell you also that what we're learning is pretty incredible. And it's driven by so many factors. It's driven by insurance. It's driven by availability. It's driven by trained clinicians. Medical, it's not really been generally medically driven until recently. It's starting to become more of an evidence-based disorder. We are not very good at this. We don't have a lot of good numbers, but boy, we're trying. And these people, I really, from what I see every day, this is a chronic illness, and we don't punish. I totally agree. You break the law, you need to. There's repercussions for that, but this is misery. This is absolute misery. And it's, we need to do better at it, and putting people in jail and expecting them to be better when they come out, because as the chief said, it's not what happens. They're generally worse if that's what they've, this is their place. If they, if they didn't know a lot of things before they went to jail, they learned a lot more while they were there. So, I just think we need to get better at treatment. And I see good stories every day. I see bad stories, but I see more good stories than I see bad stories.
We have to wrap it up. Let me share one story that's Bedford-centric, that's recent and is real, and that is the overdose death of a man that occurred last week here in Bedford, and I had his mom, who's in her 80s, and his sister come in and talk to me. Died of a heroin overdose, overdosed at midnight, went to the Elliott with Bedford Fire, came back, overdosed again at around 6 or 7 in the morning, and then died. This gentleman had a lifelong history of addictive disorders. And I can tell you that the only thing left in that particular dynamic of addiction is access. Because when death is not a deterrent, when death itself is not a deterrent to stop someone from using drugs, what is left? There's nothing left. Nothing left. The only thing that's left is access, right? And that's a true story, and that's why the criminal justice system still needs to work, because at least when we have that individual as a result of a crime, as the gentleman was talking about, we have the option and we should have the ability to be able to make sure that we put that individual into a program with some relative degree of success. But we are in a new world here where death is not a deterrent to people that are using these drugs. And once you're in, and once you've through that door, there's no turning back. There is no turning back. You're stuck with it for the rest of your life. I want to thank the panel, Marty Boldin, the Governor's Policy Advisor for Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery. Thanks, Marty, for bringing all the information you brought. Peg Crowder, history, working in the field, great. And, of course, Diane Vaccarello, who is a Board of Director member for Bedford BeBold and Bedford Family Therapy, for your insight. Thank you, panel, for coming. I want to bring everyone's attention to our next event, which is March 28th at 7 p.m. at the Bedford High School. We are having a special event. Jess Leahy, who is an author and has wrote a book, Understanding How to Parent so that Children Can Succeed.
Yeah, The Gift of Failure.
The Gift of Failure. And Diane, if you just want to talk just a moment about that.
Yeah, sure. Jessica Leahy is a local author, and she's also a teacher. She wrote the book, The Gift of Failure, and it talks about how to successfully parent our kids and our teens. And she is doing a special co-sponsored presentation between the Bedford PTG and Bedford BeBold, bringing her into the high school auditorium at 7 p.m. On March 28th. It's a Wednesday. She is going to be presenting on not just the fact that as parents we can, how we can best support our kids in succeeding, but also in not going down the path of addiction. And so she's, it's a tremendous book. If anyone has ever heard of it, The Gift of Failure, I actually recommend it. I wish it could be something that everyone who has a child could sort of be sent home with that book. We'll have copies there. She's, signing books after. There's going to be a question and answer period. Please don't miss attending this special presentation.
Great. So March 28th, Bedford High School, 7 p.m. Make sure you're there. BeBold, Bedford PTG, Jess Leahy. Great information, adds on to the pieces that we heard from the New Hampshire Teen Challenge, from our panel tonight, and it's a building block level of instruction about what we all need to know about the crisis that faces us in public health and in public safety in New Hampshire. I'm John Bryfonski, Chief of Police here in Bedford. Thank you all for coming.